Infinity Pool is finally here, guys. Alexander Skarsgård and Mia Goth killed it. I'm going to get to that in a moment. Before I do, I'm going to round up my top 15 body horror movies. Let's roll it.
Good evening.
It's nice to meet you.
Could I interest you in some tea?
So what happened after the boat sank?
I was alone.
These are in no particular order, but I'm going to start with Tusk by Kevin Smith, released in 2014. This is easily, in my opinion, one of Kevin Smith's best movies, and he originally thought it up while being stoned on one of his podcasts, and he successfully turned it into an extremely disturbing and very well executed body horror film. Justin Long stars as the main character who interviews an older gentleman played by Michael Parks, who is fantastic, by the way. This man, in particular, is obsessed with a walrus that he discovered throughout his adventures. Justin's character finds that the man he interviewed has very dark and extremely disturbing intentions. There's some phenomenal creature design in this, gnarly special effects, and all around this is a fantastic body horror piece. Definitely check it out if you missed it. I have to admit, I'm a late bloomer when it comes to Julia Ducournau's horror films, but Raw, released in 2016, is a fantastic body horror flick. It's a coming-of-age tale exploring female sexuality. Raw follows the story of Justine, who is played by Garance Millier, who is rejected by society for her carnal desires. Some seriously terrifying and disturbing scenes in this movie, but Julia Ducournau does a phenomenal job challenging male established genre barriers. Justine, studying to become a vet, develops a craving for human flesh. Let's just say that some seriously insane visuals follow that are both difficult to watch and also hard to look away from somehow. One of the best horror dramas ever written, and easily one of the more horrific tales that puts a very interesting twist on the coming of age genre.
From Universal Pictures.
Slither, released in 2008, directed by James Gunn. I love a good horror comedy. Who doesn't? Especially this one, because it wasn't afraid to explore both alien invasion and body horror. Slither follows the story of a small town that is taken over by a slithering alien plague and turns the local residents into body-snatched horrors. There's all sorts of awesome mutations and body horror in this film that make it just a total blast to watch. James Gunn's ability to use the alien parasites, too, in creative ways to turn humans into grotesque creatures is definitely disturbing and a lot of fun. It's done in a way that's just disgusting and hilarious at the same time, so it's a good time. If you're looking for a great movie to have some fun with in the body horror genre, out of any of them on this list, this is it.
Beverly Hills is known as a society of wealth and privilege, but Billy Whitney doesn't seem to be getting his share.
Society, directed by Brian Yuzna, released in 1989. Although the entire movie is basically one giant build up to that ending scene, which I won't spoil if you haven't seen it, Society displays one of the most absurd and memorable scenes in the entire body horror subgenre. Ultimately, what we get in the finale is a darkly humorous satire of the social elite. Bill Whitney feels out of place, though, in his high society family, and after he hears a recording that seems to expose his parents as secret deviants, Bill's investigation leads him to some disturbingly gruesome discoveries. Without spoiling exactly what is going on, the final minutes of Society contain indescribable symphony of horrific and seriously impressive practical effects and body transformations. Do not miss this one if you haven't seen it. It's essential if you love the genre. Tetsuo the Iron Man, directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, released in 1989. Easily one of my favorites on this list. So many iconic and disturbing scenes that to this day, they honestly hold up really well. Iconic Japanese filmmaker Shinya Tsukamoto unleashed his revolutionary cyberpunk body horror movie, Tetsuo the Iron Man, into the horror scene. The movie is a surreal story about an ordinary man whose body is gradually transforming into metal and flesh. However, the plot doesn't really matter that much to the overall experience, to be honest with you. Tetsuo is just a glorious assault on the senses that feels like a nightmare more so than a movie. The practical effects, the score, the pacing alone with those visuals make this a timeless classic in the body horror subgenre. Eraserhead, directed by David Lynch and released in 1978. Although you are going to see the Cronenberg name a lot in this list, David Lynch is a pioneer of the body horror subgenre. I would even argue that Lynch's debut film, Eraserhead, took body horror into an even more strange extreme than Cronenberg's earliest movies. Eraserhead is a surreal tale of a man, Henry Spencer, played by Jack John Nance, who is thrusted into fatherhood, and his girlfriend, Mary X, played by Charlotte Stewart, gives birth to a baby that looks more like a snake embryo than a human. The movie is ultimately an extremely interesting take on a man who is basically dealing with the emotions of unexpectedly becoming a father. What I really love about this movie, though, are the sequences are very dreamlike, and you have a very difficult time telling whether or not something is actually happening or not. Awesome practical effects, a lot of uncomfortable scenes, a lot of great body horror. You have to check this one out.
I've been waiting 6 years for your second book. Is it coming out soon?
I'm working on it.
What do you do for money then?
Infinity Pool, directed by Brandon Cronenburg and released this year. I just got back from this film like 10 minutes ago. This movie was a brilliant and wild ride and absolutely did not disappoint. I'll do my best to keep the spoilers here at a minimum, but I highly recommend going to see this movie totally blind if you can. You have been warned. I'll give you a second. Infinity Pool has an absolutely killer style, atmosphere, and also performances via Mia Goth and Alexander Skarsgård. This movie takes place at a resort that the main characters, James and Em, who have been married for quite a while, and it kind of shows, are visiting while trying to soak up some inspiration for James's new novel. Things take a wonderfully weird twist when they meet Gabby, played by Mia Goth, and her boy toy. After some fun outside the resort when they get to know each other, every American's worst nightmare unfolds while they're visiting this resort overseas. Infinity Pool brings us through a psychedelic, gruesomely violent, and shocking plotline that you cannot look away from. Mia Goth's performance in this movie is some of her best work so far, and the scenes with her and Alexander Skarsgård together are tough to look away from, but also really hard to watch. All I can say is this film is amazing on the big screen. If you're a body horror fan or just a horror fan in general, you're probably gonna love it. It's clever, it's a fun watch with a lot of plot twists. Definitely check it out, but avoid spoilers as much as you can before you go.
You have a very special nature, one we've worked hard together to unlock.
Speaking of the Cronenbergs, a more newer movie by the offspring of the ultimate Cronenberg, Possessor, directed by Brandon Cronenburg in 2020. I think it's awesome that the Cronenberg lineage continues in the body horror subgenre. It definitely looks like the body horror gene that exists, right, is strong as hell in the Cronenberg family. With Possessor, Brandon Cronenberg proved that he is fit to follow in his father's footsteps while establishing a voice that's uniquely his own. This is a really awesome, stylized sci-fi film that has some seriously impressive visuals, amazing production, and a very eerie score. The plot follows an assassin who carries out killings by taking over other people's bodies. When she finds a subject who she cannot bend into submission, it sets up a thrilling showdown that raises some provocative questions about the nature of our body autonomy in an increasingly technology-driven world. Awesome themes, great sci-fi production. That ending is super satisfying too. Titan, Julia Ducournau, released in 2021. This movie is spectacularly done. Raw established Julia Ducournau as a new director that we should all be paying attention to. She took her variety of thoughtfully grotesque cinema to new places with Titan. This is definitely an artistic horror film with some seriously disturbing imagery, but at its core, it is a remarkable work of body horror. Alexia, played by Agatha Roussel, is a woman who gets her skull reinforced with a plate of titanium. After a seriously brutal car accident, she embraces her own scars, develops a fascination with automobiles, and works as a showgirl at a motor show. The film quickly becomes a disturbingly imaginative serial killer story that sticks with you long after the finish of the movie. There's a ton of disturbing and effective imagery in Titan, but this film's real brilliance is the thoughtfulness in which it explores the way the physical body modifications can change someone's personality. One of the best on this list, definitely don't miss it. I was a late bloomer to this director. Hellraiser is a movie that smartly blends multiple subgenres of horror. The Cenobites, led by Pinhead and played by Doug Bradley, come from another dimension, which gives an element of cosmic horror in a lot of ways, and the costumes of the Cenobites definitely give that body horror flair. However, it's the narrative involving Claire Higgins' character, Julia, who tricks random men into accompanying her to her room for her to ultimately kill them, and that's where the body horror of the story really starts. She and her brother-in-law slash lover, Frank, who is played by Sean Chapman, murder the men, which leads to all of the body horror madness of the movie, but where the practical effects and body horror come into the fold is Frank himself goes through a ton of grotesque transformations, starting as a collection of bones and fluid, and then reforming into a living version of himself as he absorbs the life forces of the men that they kill. Awesome movie that still holds up today.
Every journey begins in the mind. A flight of imagination.
From Beyond, directed by Stuart Gordon and released in 1986, an extremely impressive follow-up to Reanimator, which is also on this list, so stay tuned. From Beyond is a thrilling tale of the woes of body horror and cosmic terror all wrapped into one package. Stuart Gordon used much of the same cast and crew of Reanimator, and it's based on another story by H.P. Lovecraft of the same name. The movie is a ton of fun and has a lot of grisly body horror scenes. The movie is about an experiment that gives humans access to a reality that overlaps with our own. The head scientist on the project, Dr. Praetorius, played by Ted Sorrell, is taken from another reality and transformed into a power-hungry monster that continuously morphs into hideous forms, and he increasingly distorts his human appearance as the movie goes on. There are a bunch of monsters that come through into our reality, and many of which have an affinity for eating people, starting with the head. Some awesome practical effects in this movie. While it's not as good as Reanimator, it is still a blast, so definitely check it out.
Max Wren is a victim.
I woke up with a headache.
He has been exposed to Videodrome.
I've been hallucinating for a while.
Videodrome, directed by David Cronenberg, released in 1983. This is another body horror film that screams just style and mastery. David Cronenberg's body horror creations continued in 1983 with Videodrome, which is a cult classic that embraces body horror thrills as much as it just studies them in the best way. Cronenberg cast James Woods as Max Wren, the president of a Toronto, Canada television station, who becomes convinced that a new show called Videodrome can revitalize the company in some way. The show is a body horror program within Cronenberg's body horror movie, centered around the brutal torture and murder of random victims inside of a red room. Max becomes obsessed with tracking down the makers of the show, and his quest leads to his own psychological breakdown and also terrifying body horrors. Cronenberg's surreal plot in this movie makes the gore feel more unhinged than usual, and Videodrome is one of my favorites on this list, with just the pure insanity and creativity used in this film. One of the best in the genre. Don't skip it if you've missed it somehow.
He's brilliant, but a little weird.
I've broken the 6 to 12 minute barrier. I've conquered brain death.
Reanimator, directed by Stuart Gordon, released in 1985, based on Lovecraft's 1922 short story, Herbert West. Reanimator, Stuart Gordon's brilliant gore-fest classic, is one of the most adored horror movies ever for good reason. Just pure madness. The plot follows a medical student, Dan Kane, who advertises for a roommate, and he finds one in the form of Herbert West. The roommate, initially kind of a whack job, unveils that he's been entertaining some seriously bizarre theories, specifically about reanimating the dead. It's not long before Dan finds himself under West's influence, and then they start their ghoulish experiments that just go completely bananas. Reanimator isn't just disturbing, it manages to make its grisly premise feel darkly fun and very exciting, featuring a standout performance too from Jeffrey Combs as the deranged West. The movie remains the definitive example of just 80s splatter mayhem. No body horror has really been able to top this movie. It's that good.
Human teleportation, molecular decimation, breakdown, and reformation is inherently purging.
One of the best monster movies ever made, The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg, released in 1986. This is a very sad commentary on the emotions that we feel when we're caring for somebody who is terminally ill. I can relate to that, and monster movies are a great way to feel human and get a little bit of comfort. But The Fly is a perfect marriage of body horror and the monster movie. Jeff Goldblum's character becomes his own monster after his reckless involvement with a teleportation device, while an insect effect, a brundlefly to be specific, was in the pods. While any body horror feature inevitably moves into the monstrous character traits taking root in people, the narrative ultimately shows that the monster was entirely his own creation and his own fault, not a beast from another dimension or some sort of classic psychopathic monster from a storybook. That piece of the film makes it even more interesting and really unique in my opinion.
12 men have just discovered something. For 100,000 years, it was buried in the snow and ice.
The Thing, directed by John Carpenter and released in 1982, one of my favorite movies of all time, man. The Thing is still unmatched in my opinion as a horror movie in pacing, practical effects, and also atmosphere. Starring Kurt Russell in one of his most iconic roles, The Thing is one of the best examples of an alien invasion horror film. Based on the novel Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr. and taking inspiration from The Thing from Another World, released in 1951, The Thing is about an alien being that has the ability to mimic any other living creature that it wants, and the movie takes place in the Antarctic where there's just nothing but isolation. When the alien is threatened, the being transforms into bizarre monstrosities that often still retain a bit of its most recent form that it took, and man is this movie awesome because of this premise. What you get throughout the film is pure horror as the creature morphs into terrifying monsters that consume and mimic everything around it. The paranoia of the crew is a great addition to the scare factor too. The isolation adds to it, and the practical effects to this day are still horrifying and some of the best in the industry. Check out this list here if you want to see my favorite horror movies with creepy dolls. Check out this list here for underrated horror films that are streaming on Shudder right now. Thanks so much for watching. I'll scare you guys next time.